It started with a quiet shuffle onto the stage. An elderly woman, small in stature, with silver hair pulled back neatly, and a gentle, uncertain smile. The room, filled with murmurs and side glances, didn't expect much. Some even chuckled softly, assuming it would be a harmless, perhaps awkward performance. After all, what could this fragile woman possibly bring to a stage that had seen booming voices, flashy costumes, and loud personalities? She didn't look like someone who belonged, under the spotlight. But as she sat at the piano, her hands slightly trembling, there was a pause, an uneasy silence that settled over the room. She wasn't there for attention or to prove a point. Her presence was quiet, almost humble. But behind those soft eyes was a lifetime of music, loss, love, and a story no one had bothered to ask about. What many assumed would be a moment of embarrassment quickly turned into something no one saw coming. The first few notes from the piano were shaky, uncertain. A few more murmurs. But then, something shifted. Her fingers began to dance. Not with the showy flair of a trained performer, but with a raw, honest emotion that spoke louder than any microphone ever could. The room grew still. Laughter faded. Eyes widened. And within moments, tears replaced smiles as her music filled the space with a haunting kind of beauty. Something that could only come from someone who had lived, lost, and loved deeply. Her melody wasn't perfect, but it was real. It reached people in a way that no flashy act ever could. People came expecting to be entertained, maybe even amused. But instead, they were humbled. No one saw her coming, and that was exactly what made her unforgettable. Who was she? Where had she come from? And what was the story behind that aching melody that left even the judges silent, blinking away tears? What happened next would not only change the way they saw her, it would change how they saw themselves. Her name was Margaret, though most people in the audience didn't know that yet. At 76 years old, she had lived a quiet life far from the lights and noise of stages. She wasn't a trained musician in the traditional sense. In fact, she hadn't touched a piano in almost 30 years. Life had taken over, raising a family, caring for her late husband, working long hours at a small-town diner to make ends meet. The music had always been in her, but there was never the time or the space to let it out. Until now. Margaret didn't come to the audition looking for fame. Her granddaughter had signed her up secretly, hoping to spark a little light in her grandmother's life after years of silence and solitude. When the producers first saw Margaret's name on the list, they were skeptical. They had expected another, light-hearted act, maybe even something to gently poke fun at. After all, an elderly woman in worn-out shoes and a faded sweater didn't exactly scream, "Showstopper." But something about her calm presence made them curious enough to let her through. Backstage, she sat alone, quietly humming a tune only she seemed to know. Others rehearsed loudly, stretching, pacing, adjusting microphones. Margaret just closed her eyes and waited. The piano wasn't even her choice. It was just the only instrument available. She hadn't told anyone that the song she planned to play wasn't from any sheet music. It was something she wrote herself, decades ago, during one of the hardest times of her life. A time she had never really spoken about, not even to her family. When she finally sat at the keys, the weight of those memories came rushing back. The lights, the eyes, the judgment, it all faded. What remained was her story, pouring out through her hands. Every note carried the burden of years, of grief buried deep, and of love lost too soon. And yet, no one in the audience knew any of this. They were still trying to figure her out, still wondering if what they'd just heard was a fluke or something much deeper. One thing was certain. This was no ordinary performance, and Margaret was no ordinary woman. As Margaret stepped away from the piano, the room remained still. No applause yet, just stunned silence. Some people blinked, Others glanced around, unsure of what they'd just witnessed. One of the judges leaned forward, as if trying to get a better look at her. Another wiped at their eyes, quickly pretending it was nothing. Margaret gave a small, almost shy nod and began to walk off stage. She didn't expect cheers or praise. In truth, she hadn't expected anything at all. Backstage, her granddaughter Lily rushed toward her, arms wide, eyes red. "Grandma, that was incredible," she whispered. Margaret just smiled faintly, brushing it off. But deep down, she felt something stir. Not pride exactly, something more complicated. Fear, maybe, or doubt. Because while the audience was touched, none of them knew what the song truly meant. It wasn't just music, it was a memory. One that she had buried for decades. The conflict wasn't just on stage, it was inside her. That melody had been written during a time when her world was falling apart. A time when she had lost her first child, when the hospital lights were too bright and the halls too quiet. She never talked about it, not to her husband, not even to Lily's mother. That grief had aged with her, quietly shaping who she became. And now, suddenly, it had been heard by a room full of strangers. But not everyone backstage felt the same way. Another contestant, a young man named Darren, who had trained for years and expected to be the evening star, stood in the shadows watching. He wasn't cruel, but he was bitter. He had worked endlessly, private lessons, vocal coaches, expensive instruments, and yet the biggest reaction of the night had come from someone who hadn't even rehearsed. To him, it felt unfair. And though he wouldn't say it out loud, there was resentment building. The producers, meanwhile, were buzzing in a corner, whispering about how to frame her for the next round. One saw a ratings opportunity. Another warned they couldn't rely on emotional shock alone. What if she can't do it again? They asked. Margaret had unknowingly stepped into something bigger than she expected. And now, eyes were watching. Some with hope, some with doubt, and some with quiet envy. The next round was only days away, and Margaret was suddenly at the center of attention. Overnight, clips of her performance had spread online. Comments poured in, some calling her an inspiration, others questioning whether it had all been staged. Is she real? Where did she come from? Was that song really hers? The buzz was overwhelming, but Margaret didn't even know most of it was happening. She didn't use social media. She spent those days quietly at home, hands resting gently on the old keys of her piano, the same one that had sat untouched in her living room for years. Lily, on the other hand, saw everything. She tried to shield her grandmother from the noise, from the comments that questioned her story, her talent, even her worth. But the pressure was growing. The producers had called twice already, asking for more interviews, more background, more drama. They wanted Margaret to open up, to share her pain for the cameras. Talk about your past, they pushed. People need to connect with you. But Margaret wasn't ready. She had spent a lifetime keeping that door closed. Now they wanted it wide open, live, in front of millions. Meanwhile, behind the scenes, things were shifting. Darren, the contestant who had watched from the wings, had become more vocal. He began whispering to others, planting doubts. "She's only here because of pity," he said. "She's not competition. She's a moment." Some nodded along. Others weren't sure, but the seed was planted. Rumors started to swirl. Had Margaret even written the song? Was someone helping her? Was this all just a carefully planned emotional act? The night of the next performance arrived. The stage lights were brighter, the audience louder, but Margaret stood at the side, quiet as ever. Lily squeezed her hand, but Margaret's eyes were far away. She wasn't thinking about the cameras or the critics. She was thinking about that melody, what it had meant to her, and whether she could carry it again under the weight of so many expectations. Then came the unexpected twist, a change in the order. Margaret's name was moved to close the show, the final act. The pressure was immense, and as the other contestants performed, the atmosphere tightened. Every eye, every whisper, every unspoken question was waiting. For her. As the stage lights dimmed for the final performance of the night, a hush swept over the audience. Backstage, Margaret stood just a few feet from the curtain, her hands folded, her heart beating faster than it had in years. Lily stood beside her, trying to stay calm, but she could feel something was off. The air felt heavy, not just with nerves, but with tension she couldn't quite name. Margaret had practiced quietly all week, but now, with all eyes waiting, she suddenly seemed unsure. Then, without warning, a stagehand rushed over, whispering urgently into a producer's ear. A moment later, Margaret was told there had been a change. The piano she had rehearsed on was being swapped out. Technical issues, they claimed. She would be playing on a different one, slightly newer, slightly stiffer, and one she had never touched before. Margaret's face didn't show much, but inside she felt something twist. The song she had prepared, her own composition, relied on subtle touches, emotional timing, the kind of familiarity that only comes from knowing every key like an old friend. Now, even that comfort had been taken away. But that wasn't all. Minutes before she was set to go on, Lily received a message from a friend watching the live stream. A leaked story was circulating online. It claimed Margaret had received special treatment from the producers. It alleged that her story was being used to boost ratings and that parts of her background had been embellished. There was even an anonymous quote. Some thought it was Darren saying, "She's not the musician people think she is. It's all for sympathy." Lily stared at the screen, heart racing, unsure if she should show it to her grandmother or protect her from it. Back in the audience, the judges exchanged quiet glances. They'd seen the story too. The atmosphere had shifted. The room that once waited with breathless hope now sat with mixed expectations. Some still believed in Margaret. Others now watched with folded arms, unsure if they were about to witness something meaningful or something manipulated. And Margaret? She stood at the edge of the curtain, the piano just steps away, unaware of the storm building behind her. All she had now was the music in her head and the weight of a truth no one else could tell. Margaret walked slowly toward the piano, the spotlight following her every step. The audience was silent, waiting, not with the warmth from her first performance, but with a strange tension, a mix of curiosity and quiet doubt. She sat down, hands resting on the unfamiliar keys, and took a deep breath. The whispers from backstage, the article, the changed piano, it all swirled in her mind. But as she looked out into the darkened crowd, she thought of something else. She thought of her daughter, the one she had lost all those years ago. And then, gently, she began to play. The first few notes rang out uncertain, almost fragile. There was no showmanship, no dramatic gestures, just the sound of a woman pouring decades of silence into music. And slowly, something began to shift. The melody, though slightly different on this new piano, still held its weight. It carried sorrow, yes, but also forgiveness, hope, and love. The room seemed to exhale with her. People who had doubted her leaned forward. Those who came looking for flaws now found themselves blinking back tears. As she played the final note, the hall was frozen in place. Then, a single person stood and clapped. Another followed. And within seconds, the entire audience was on their feet. The judges didn't speak. They just stood too, visibly moved. Margaret looked out at them, eyes shining but dry. She had said everything she needed to, without a single word. Backstage, Darren watched in silence. but something inside him softened. Maybe it was guilt, maybe it was respect. Whatever it was, he didn't say a word when the results were announced. Margaret had advanced to the finals, not by pity, not by production tricks, but by something far more powerful: truth. But just as things seemed to settle, one of the judges leaned into the microphone with a curious smile. "Margaret," he said, "we've been reviewing your background, and there's something interesting we discovered." The room leaned in. "You were once accepted to a conservatory in your 20s. You turned it down. Would you tell us why?" Margaret looked up, surprised. The memory returned in an instant. A letter she never spoke about. A dream she buried to care for someone else. And now, in front of the world, the story wasn't over. It was just beginning. Margaret took a breath, the judge's question still hanging in the air. The memory of that old letter came back clearly. Crisp paper, careful words, and the name of a music conservatory she had once dreamed of attending. "I did get in," she said softly, her voice carrying through the silent room. "But I didn't go. My mother got sick. I had to stay and take care of her. Life just moved in a different direction after that." There was no bitterness in her voice, only honesty. "Sometimes you put your dreams aside. You don't forget them. You just hold them quietly." The audience listened, many nodding, some with tears again in their eyes. It was a story many could relate to. Sacrifices made in silence, dreams paused for the sake of love or duty. Margaret's words hit harder than any perfect performance ever could. She wasn't just an elderly woman with a touching song. She was a reminder that it's never too late to return to something you once loved. Backstage, Lily couldn't stop smiling. She finally understood the depth of her grandmother's silence over the years, not because she had nothing to say, but because the music had always been her voice. And Darren, who had once questioned Margaret's presence, approached her quietly after the show. "I was wrong," he said, eyes lowered. "You didn't need to prove anything. You already had it." Margaret smiled gently and nodded. There was no anger, only grace. The finale came and went, and though Margaret didn't win the title, it didn't matter. Her performance had left a lasting mark on the judges, the audience, and millions who watched her story unfold online. She was invited to perform again, not as a contestant, but as a guest of honor. People remembered her not for a trophy, but for the truth she brought with her music. And in the end, Margaret went back home, not to fade into the background, but to play every day. For herself, for the past, for the future. Her story reminded everyone watching, no matter your age, your losses, or how long you've waited, it's never too late to be heard.